It was May 1937, and the Mississippi Delta was drowning in heat. The air was thick and humid, carrying the smell of river water and cotton fields through the open windows of a nameless juke joint somewhere deep in the heart of the Delta, where the roads turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. The sun had just set, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and deep purple, colors that seemed to bleed into each other like watercolors on wet paper, like something being born or dying, or both at once. Inside, 50 people gathered in the dim lamplight that flickered and danced with every breath of wind, workers with dirt still under their fingernails from a long day in the fields, drifters with nowhere else to go and no particular reason to be anywhere, women in worn dresses that had seen better days but still held onto their dignity, men with calloused hands that told stories of hard labor and harder lives. They came for the music. They came to forget, even if just for a few hours, the weight of their existence, the burden of being poor and black in the American South in 1937. They came because word had spread through the Delta like wildfire that Robert Johnson was playing that night, and when Robert Johnson played, something happened, something changed. Something opened up that was usually closed. But what they witnessed in those 6 hours would haunt them for the rest of their lives, would follow them into their dreams and their waking hours, would become a story they could barely tell and couldn't quite forget. Some would never speak of it again, carrying the memory like a stone in their chest, heavy and cold and permanent. Others would whisper the story only to those they trusted completely, their voices trembling with something that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite awe, but somewhere in between, a mixture of terror and wonder that had no name, that existed in a space language couldn't quite reach. The door opened just after 8 o'clock, and the sound of it, the creak of old hinges, the scrape of wood on wood, made everyone look up. Robert Johnson walked in carrying his guitar case, and everyone who was there, every single person in that room, would remember the same thing for the rest of their days, would carry this image with them like a photograph burned into their minds. He looked impossibly young, impossibly alive, vibrant in a way that seemed almost unnatural, as if he were lit from within by some invisible flame, some inner fire that burned brighter than it should. His skin was smooth as riverstone, without a mark or blemish, glowing with health and vitality. His eyes were clear and bright as morning water, sharp and focused, taking in everything at once. His movements were fluid and easy, like someone who had never known a moment of pain or doubt, never felt the weight of the world pressing down on their shoulders. He wore a dark suit that fit him well, pressed and clean, despite the dust of the Delta roads. Despite the heat and the humidity and the long miles traveled, a white shirt, crisp at the collar, bright against his skin, a hat tilted just so, at an angle that suggested confidence without arrogance, style without pretension. He smiled at the room, a quick flash of white teeth that seemed to light up his entire face, and nodded to the man behind the bar. A gesture of recognition, of respect, of acknowledgement between two men who knew the weight of the world. There was an energy about him, something electric, something that made the air around him seem to shimmer and pulse, as if reality itself bent slightly in his presence. He looked like a man who had never known a hard day, never felt the weight of anything heavier than a song, never carried a burden that music couldn't ease. 23 years old, maybe 24 at most. Young enough to believe the world still held promises, young enough to think tomorrow would always come, young enough to make deals without fully understanding the price. He didn't say much, didn't make any grand entrance or announcement. That's what people remembered most clearly, the silence of his arrival, the quiet confidence. He wasn't one for long speeches or grand introductions, wasn't the type to call attention to himself with words. The music would do that. The music always did. He just set his case down near the small wooden stage, nothing more than a raised platform in the corner, built from old planks and prayer, and the desperate need for something, anything, that lifted you up even a few inches above the ordinary world. and opened it with slow, deliberate movements that suggested ritual, reverence, something almost sacred. His fingers moved over the clasps with a gentleness that spoke of deep familiarity, of love even. The guitar inside gleamed dully in the lamplight, its wood worn smooth by countless hands, countless songs, countless nights of playing until dawn. He lifted it out with both hands, cradled it for a moment like a man might cradle a child or a lover, like something precious and irreplaceable, then sat down on a stool someone had placed for him. The room quieted almost immediately. Not all at once, but gradually, like a held breath, like water settling after a stone has been thrown into its depths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses stopped clinking. The sound of feet shuffling, of bodies shifting in chairs, all of it faded to silence. Even the air seemed to still, to hold itself in anticipation. People leaned in, drawn forward by some invisible magnetism, some pull they couldn't resist and didn't want to. They had heard stories about Robert Johnson, whispered tales that traveled from town to town, juke joint to juke joint, about the way he played, about where that talent came from, about deals made at crossroads at midnight, about prices paid in darkness, about things that shouldn't be spoken aloud but couldn't be completely silenced. And now, here he was, real, flesh and bone, sitting on a wooden stool with a guitar in his hands and something in his eyes that looked like knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes with a cost, the kind that marks you forever. Before we go any further down this road, before we step into that room and witness what those 50 people saw, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss a story from Soul Chronicles. Leave a comment and tell me which blues legend you want me to uncover next, because every soul here has a secret worth telling. Every life has a darkness worth exploring. Every story has a truth that needs to be spoken. Now, let's step back into that night. The night 50 people saw something they would never forget, something that would change them forever. The night that proved some legends are real, some stories are true, and some prices are exactly as terrible as they sound. He began to play, and the first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like he was testing the room, feeling its edges, learning its contours and corners and secret spaces. His fingers moved across the strings with a delicate touch, coaxing out sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath the earth, from some underground river that flowed in darkness and had never seen the sun. Then his fingers found their rhythm, found their purpose, and the sound changed completely. It grew. It expanded. It filled the space like water filling a vessel, curled around the walls like smoke, seeped into the floorboards like blood, climbed up the legs of chairs and tables like vines. It wasn't just music, wasn't just organized sound waves traveling through air. Anyone who was there would tell you that, would insist on it with a fervor that bordered on desperation. It was something else, something deeper, something older, something that touched a place inside you that you didn't know existed until that moment, a place that had been waiting your whole life to be reached. His voice came next, raw and aching, sliding over the notes like smoke, like silk, like something that could cut you and heal you at the same time. He sang about heartbreak that never quite healed, about loneliness that no amount of company could ease, about roads that stretched into darkness with no promise of dawn, no guarantee of arrival. He sang about love that left scars deeper than any knife could make, about choices that couldn't be unmade no matter how much you wished you could go back, about debts that came due when you least expected them and always cost more than you thought you'd agreed to pay. The kind of songs that made you feel like he was singing directly to you and only you, about things you thought no one else could understand, about secrets you kept locked away in the darkest corners of your heart where even you were afraid to look. The first hour passed like minutes, like seconds, like time itself had forgotten how to move forward in the normal way. Time seemed to bend around the music, to warp and stretch in strange ways that defied every clock and every natural law. People drank, but they didn't taste what they were drinking, couldn't have told you if it was whiskey or water or something else entirely. They swayed to rhythms they couldn't quite follow, couldn't quite predict, rhythms that seemed older than the delta itself, older than the country, older than memory, older than anything that had a name. Some women danced, their bodies moving in ways they didn't consciously control, responding to something primal and ancient that the music awakened. Some men closed their eyes, their faces showing expressions of pain and pleasure mixed together, until you couldn't tell one from the other, until they became the same thing, two sides of a single coin. Robert played without stopping, without pausing between songs, without giving anyone a moment to catch their breath or remember where they were. One melody bled into the next, seamless, hypnotic, creating a continuous river of sound that carried everyone along with it, whether they wanted to go or not, whether they chose to or found themselves simply swept away. His fingers moved so fast they blurred, becoming almost invisible, as if the guitar were playing itself, as if he were just a conduit for something that wanted to be heard. His foot tapped out a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere below the earth, from the very center of the world, a heartbeat that was older than humanity and would outlast it. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, catching the lamplight, making his skin glisten like he'd been dipped in something precious. But he didn't wipe it away, didn't acknowledge it, didn't seem to even notice. Just kept playing, kept singing, kept pulling something out of that guitar that shouldn't have been possible, shouldn't have been allowed, shouldn't have existed in the natural world that everyone else inhabited. It was sometime around the second hour, maybe a little past it, when the first person noticed something was wrong. A woman named Evelyn, sitting near the front with a glass of gin in her hand that had long since grown warm and flat, looked up at Robert's face and felt something shift in her chest, something cold and heavy settling there. She would later tell her sister, in a voice barely above a whisper, in the darkness of a bedroom with the door closed and locked, that she thought she was imagining it at first, that maybe the lamplight was playing tricks on her tired eyes, that maybe she'd had too much to drink, though she'd barely touched her glass, though the gin sat warm and forgotten in her hand. But she couldn't stop staring at Robert's face, couldn't pull her eyes away no matter how much she wanted to. Something about it looked different, not drastically, not obviously, just slightly off in a way she couldn't quite name, couldn't quite put her finger on, like looking at something familiar that had been moved just an inch to the left. The smoothness of his cheeks seemed less smooth, rougher somehow. The brightness in his eyes seemed dimmed, just a fraction, like a lamp being turned down by invisible hands, by some force that was draining the light away drop by drop. The sharpness of his jawline seemed softer, blurred at the edges, like a photograph going out of focus. She blinked hard, shook her head, took another sip of her warm gin, and immediately regretted it. Told herself she was tired from a long day picking cotton under the merciless sun. Told herself it was nothing, just her imagination, just the heat and the exhaustion and the close air in the room. Told herself to stop being foolish, to stop looking for problems where there weren't any. But her eyes kept returning to his face, kept searching for confirmation of what she thought she was seeing, what she was afraid she was seeing. And the more she looked, the more certain she became. Something was changing. Something was terribly, impossibly wrong. But it wasn't nothing. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't the lamplight or the gin or her tired eyes. By the third hour, more people began to notice, began to see what Evelyn had seen, what she had tried to dismiss, but couldn't. Whispers started in the back of the room. Quiet and uncertain at first, people afraid to speak their observations aloud, afraid that saying it would make it real, would make it undeniable. Then growing more insistent as more people saw it, as the evidence became impossible to ignore. A man named Thomas, a field hand with a scar across his knuckles from a knife fight years ago that had settled an argument about a woman neither man ended up with, leaned over to his friend and said in a low voice that shook slightly, "Something ain't right about him. Look at his face." Just look at it. His friend, a man called Silas, who had known Robert before, who had heard him play in other places when he was still learning, when his talent was remarkable but still human, still explainable, squinted at the stage through the smoke-filled air and said nothing for a long moment. But he saw it too. They all did, once they started looking, once their eyes adjusted to what was happening right in front of them in plain sight. Robert Johnson was changing, was transforming, was aging before their very eyes. His face had grown thinner, the skin pulling tighter across his cheekbones, revealing the architecture of bone beneath, making him look gaunt and hollow. Lines had appeared at the corners of his eyes, faint but undeniable, like someone had drawn them there with a fine pencil while no one was watching. His hands, those impossibly fast, impossibly skilled hands that moved across the strings like they were dancing, like they were telling their own story, had begun to tremble slightly between chords. Not enough to affect his playing, not enough to make him miss a note or lose his rhythm, but enough to see, enough to know that something was happening that shouldn't be happening, that couldn't be happening in any world that made sense. He kept playing through it all, never stopped, never took a break, never asked for water or whiskey or a moment to rest, to catch his breath, to collect himself. The music poured out of him like it was the only thing keeping him upright, like it was the only thing keeping him alive, like stopping would mean death or worse. His voice grew rougher with each song, edged with something ragged and worn, like cloth that had been rubbed thin and was starting to tear. The songs became darker, more desperate, more urgent, as if he were racing against something, trying to outrun something that was catching up with him. He sang about devils and bargains made at midnight crossroads, where four roads met and anything was possible. He sang about prices paid in blood and youth and souls, about debts coming due when you least expected them, when you thought you'd gotten away with it. He sang about giving up everything for a gift, for a talent, for the ability to make a guitar sing in ways that other men could only dream of, could only approximate but never truly achieve. He sang like a man who knew exactly what he had traded and was trying to make peace with it, trying to justify it, trying to convince himself it was worth it, even as he watched the price being extracted from his flesh. The room grew colder with each passing minute, though the windows were still open and the night air outside was warm and thick, humid enough to drink. People pulled their jackets tighter around themselves, rubbed their arms, breathed out, and watched their breath fog in air that shouldn't be cold enough for that defied every thermometer and every reasonable explanation. Some considered leaving, standing up, walking out that door and never looking back, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever was happening on that stage. But when they tried to move, when they gathered their will and their courage and tried to stand, they found they couldn't. Their legs wouldn't respond, their bodies wouldn't obey. It was as if the music had rooted them to their seats, had bound them to the moment with invisible chains made of sound and rhythm, and something older than either. They were trapped, held captive not by force, but by something deeper, something that bypassed their will entirely, that reached past their conscious minds and held them at a level they couldn't control or resist. They watched, transfixed, unable to look away even though they wanted to, as the man on the stage continued to transform before their eyes, continued to age in ways that violated every natural law they had ever known. By the fourth hour, by the time the night had fully settled and the world outside seemed to have disappeared entirely, Robert Johnson looked 10 years older than when he had walked through that door. 10 full years compressed into a few hours of playing, years stolen or borrowed or bought with music, with every note and every word and every strum. His hair, which had been jet black and thick, gleaming in the lamplight, was now streaked with grey at the temples, silver threads woven through the darkness like someone had spilled ash there. His shoulders had begun to hunch slightly, to curve forward, as if the weight of the guitar had grown heavier with each passing song, as if gravity itself were pressing down on him with increasing force, trying to bend him, trying to break him. The lines on his face had deepened into creases, into furrows that spoke of age and experience and things seen that couldn't be unseen, that marked you permanently. His lips, once full and quick to smile, were thin now and pressed tight between verses, as if holding back words that shouldn't be spoken, truths that were too dangerous to voice. His eyes, those clear, bright eyes that had sparkled with life and confidence and something like joy, had become hollowed, shadowed, haunted by things that moved in the darkness behind them, by memories or visions or debts that had yet to be collected. He looked like a man who had lived too long and seen too much, who carried memories that were too heavy for any one person to bear, who knew things that no human should know. A young woman named Clara, no more than 19 years old, sitting with her mother near the middle of the room, started to cry. Tears rolled down her cheeks, silent and steady, and she didn't know why, couldn't have explained it if someone had asked. She wasn't sad exactly, though sadness was part of it. She was frightened, yes, deeply frightened. But it was more than that, something larger and more complex. She just felt it, felt the wrongness of what she was witnessing deep in her bones, the impossibility of it, the terrible beauty of it. The sense that she was watching something sacred and profane at the same time. Something that shouldn't be happening, but was somehow meant to be seen, meant to be witnessed, meant to be remembered. Her mother, sitting beside her, put an arm around her shoulders and said nothing, because what was there to say? What words existed in any language that could adequately describe what they were watching? They were watching a man age in real time, watching something take pieces of him with every note, every word, every strum of the strings, watching him give himself away one song at a time, watching the music drain him like a vampire, like some parasite that fed on youth and life and vitality. And he kept playing, kept giving, kept pouring himself into that guitar as if it were the only thing that mattered, as if the music was worth any price, any cost, any sacrifice, no matter how terrible. The fifth hour was the worst. By then, by the time exhaustion had settled over everyone in the room like a blanket, making everything feel dreamlike and unreal, Robert Johnson looked 20 years older. 20 full years of life compressed into a single evening, decades stolen in hours, a lifetime compressed into a performance. His face was gaunt, the skin sagging, the bones prominent beneath papery flesh that looked ready to tear at the slightest touch, as fragile as old newspaper. His hands shook visibly now, tremors running through them constantly, making his playing slightly uneven, adding a roughness to the notes that somehow made them more beautiful, more human, more real, more painful. Grey hair had spread across his entire head like frost, like snow, turning him into an old man in front of 50 pairs of watching eyes that couldn't look away, that couldn't deny what they were seeing. His back was bent, curved like a question mark, like someone asking why, or how much longer, or was it worth it? Like a man who had spent decades carrying heavy loads up steep hills. His breathing was labored between songs, ragged and wet, as if each breath cost him something precious, as if the simple act of drawing air into his lungs required more effort than it should. He looked like an old man, a man in his 60s, maybe older, maybe much older. A man whose body had been used up and hollowed out, whose life had been spent like currency until nothing remained but empty pockets and regrets. And still, somehow, impossibly defying every expectation and every reasonable limit, he played. Still, he sang. Still, he gave everything he had left and then more. Some people tried to leave then in that fifth hour when the wrongness of it all became too much to bear. They stood up, their legs shaking, their faces pale with fear and confusion and something like horror. But when they turned toward the door, when they looked for the way out, they found their legs wouldn't move in that direction, found their feet wouldn't take them where they wanted to go. When they looked at the exit, it seemed impossibly far away, miles away, as if the room had stretched and expanded to impossible dimensions, as if space itself had been warped. The music held them. The moment held them. Some invisible force kept them pinned to their seats, kept them as witnesses to something they didn't understand, something that defied every natural law they had ever known, every rule they thought governed reality. And deep down, in a place they didn't want to acknowledge, in a place they would spend the rest of their lives trying to ignore or forget, they knew they were supposed to be there, that this was meant to be seen, that they had been chosen somehow to bear witness to this impossible transformation, to carry this story forward, to remember when everyone else forgot. A man in the back, a preacher named Elijah, who rarely set foot in such places, who had only come because someone had begged him to, who still felt guilty for being there at all, stood and shouted with all the authority his position afforded him, his voice cracking with fear and righteousness mixed together in equal measure. "In the name of the Lord, stop! Stop this wickedness! Stop this ungodly display! Stop letting the devil work through you!" But Robert didn't stop, didn't even look up, didn't acknowledge the interruption in any way, didn't seem to hear it at all. Just kept playing, his fingers moving over the strings with a precision that seemed impossible given the state of his hands, given the tremors that shook them, given the age that had settled into his bones like rot. The preacher sat back down slowly, deflated, his face pale as chalk, his hands trembling, his faith shaken in ways he couldn't articulate, couldn't process, couldn't reconcile with everything he thought he knew about God and the devil and the way the world worked. He would leave the ministry 6 months later, would abandon his calling and move north to Chicago where no one knew him, where he could start over, where he could try to forget. He would never explain why to anyone who asked, and he would never ever speak of that night, would take the memory to his grave, sealed and silent. The 6th hour arrived like a long exhale, like the world finally releasing a breath it had been holding for far too long, like something essential finally giving way. The sky outside had begun to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping through the windows in shades of grey and pale blue, announcing the coming day, the return of the ordinary world. Robert Johnson played his final song. It was slow, mournful, filled with a longing that seemed to reach beyond the room, beyond the night, beyond life itself, and into whatever lay on the other side, whatever waited in the darkness after the music stopped. His voice was barely more than a whisper now, cracked and worn, threadbare as an old shirt that had been washed too many times, that was more holes than fabric. His hands could barely hold the guitar, the tremors so violent now that it seemed impossible he could play at all, that he could coax any sound out of those strings. He looked ancient, frail, used up, a husk of the young man who had walked through that door just 6 hours before, a shadow of what he had been, barely recognizable. The song ended on a single, lingering note that seemed to hang in the air long after his fingers left the strings, long after the last vibration should have faded into silence. It hung there like a question no one could answer, like an accusation no one could deny, like a goodbye that carried more weight than words ever could. Then silence. Complete silence. A silence so profound it was almost painful, almost physical, like something pressing against your ears. A silence that filled the room like water filling a drowning man's lungs, drowning out everything else. Robert sat for a moment, head bowed, shoulders heaving with effort, each breath sounding like it might be his last, like his body might simply give up. Slowly, painfully, moving like a man 3 times his actual age, like every joint had been replaced with broken glass, he stood. The guitar hung from his hand like it weighed 100 pounds, like it was made of lead instead of wood, like it was the heaviest thing in the world. He looked out at the room, at the 50 people who had watched him transform, who had witnessed the impossible, who would carry this night with them forever, and for just a moment, something like sorrow passed across his ruined face. Or maybe it was relief, or maybe it was regret, or maybe it was something else entirely. some emotion that had no name because it belonged to an experience no one else had ever had, that existed outside the normal range of human feeling. It was hard to say, hard to read on a face that had aged so far beyond recognition. Then he smiled, a thin, tired smile that contained more sadness than any frown, more pain than any scream, and said in a voice like gravel, like rust, like old paper crumbling, "Thank you kindly." He packed his guitar with shaking hands, fumbling with the clasps, taking much longer than it should have, his fingers refusing to obey him properly. He closed the case finally, lifted it with visible effort, with a grunt of pain or exertion, and walked toward the door. Every step looked like it cost him everything he had left. Every movement seemed to require all his remaining strength. People parted to let him through, pressing themselves against the walls, afraid to touch him, afraid to get too close to whatever had just happened, whatever had just been revealed, afraid that it might be contagious, that they might catch whatever had taken him, that they might end up like him. The door opened. Morning light spilled in, harsh and golden, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, like tiny spirits, like fragments of something that had been broken. Robert Johnson stepped out into that light, a silhouette against the dawn, bent and broken and ancient, and disappeared down the road. Slow, shuffling, old, gone. No one moved for a long time. They sat in the silence, in the aftermath, in the space where the music had been, in the empty air that felt heavier somehow than when it had been filled with sound. Finally, someone stood, then another, then everyone, slowly, reluctantly, like people waking from a dream they weren't sure they wanted to leave. They filed out slowly, quietly, avoiding each other's eyes, unable to speak about what they had seen, unable to process it, unable to fit it into any framework that made sense. What do you say after witnessing something like that? What words exist to capture the impossible? What do you do with a memory that shouldn't exist but does, that burns in your mind like a brand, that marks you permanently? Most of them went home to families who asked where they'd been, what they'd seen, why they looked so shaken. Some went to work, moving through their daily routines like automatons, their minds elsewhere. A few went straight to church, fell to their knees before anyone else arrived, and prayed for understanding, for forgiveness, for the ability to forget, knowing even as they prayed that they never would. But all of them, every single one, carried that night with them, heavy and strange and impossible for the rest of their lives, until their dying days and beyond. 3 days later, 3 impossibly normal days during which the sun rose and set and the world continued as if nothing had changed. Someone saw Robert Johnson in another town, 40 miles away. He was playing at a street corner, his guitar case open for coins, a few dollars already scattered across the worn velvet lining. People passing by and dropping change without really listening, without really seeing. And he looked young again, impossibly, inexplicably young. Smooth skin, bright eyes, easy movements, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't aged decades in a single night. Like the transformation had never occurred, had been a mass hallucination, had been nothing but imagination and lamplight and exhaustion. A man named William, who had been in that juke joint, who had watched the whole thing from beginning to end, who hadn't slept properly since, who jumped at shadows and woke from nightmares he couldn't quite remember, approached him with hesitant steps. His hands were shaking, his mouth was dry, and he said in a voice that shook almost as badly as his hands, You played in Clarksdale a few nights ago, didn't you? At that place off Highway 61. Robert looked up from his guitar, tilted his head slightly like a bird examining something curious, and smiled that quick flash of white teeth that William remembered from before, from when he was young, from the beginning of that terrible night. I play a lot of places, friend. Can't remember them all. Delta's full of places to play. William pressed on, his voice urgent now, desperate, needing confirmation or denial or something, anything. "You looked different. You looked—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't find the words, couldn't say, "You looked old," or "You aged 20 years," or "I watched you become ancient," because those words sounded insane even in his own head. Robert's smile faded slowly, melting away like snow in sun. He looked down at his guitar, his fingers resting lightly on the strings, not playing, just touching them, as if drawing comfort from their presence, from their familiarity. Then he said so quietly that William almost didn't hear it, so quietly that he would spend years wondering if he had imagined it, if his mind had supplied the words it wanted to hear. "Every time I play, it takes some of me, but it gives it back, eventually." "What takes it?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper now, afraid of the answer, but needing to hear it. "What are you talking about? What's happening to you? What did you do?" Robert didn't answer, didn't look up, just started playing again, his fingers moving across the strings with impossible skill, creating music that drew people closer, that made them stop and listen, that made them forget their questions and their fears. And William, unsettled, frightened, more confused than before, walked away. He would never speak to Robert Johnson again, would never try to understand what he had witnessed, would never seek out the other 49 people who had been there. Some things, he decided as he walked away and tried to forget, were better left alone. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some prices weren't meant to be understood. You just paid them and moved on and tried not to think about what you'd given up or what you'd gained. But the question lingered, followed William home, followed all of them home. What takes it? What kind of bargain had Robert Johnson made that allowed him to play like no one else, like no one before or since, but demanded pieces of his life in return, demanded his youth, his health, his years? What force was at work in that juke joint, pulling years from his body with every song, every note, every strum, only to return them later like a debt being temporarily forgiven, but never truly cancelled, never truly paid off? What entity had its hooks in him, was feeding on him, was using him as a conduit for something that shouldn't exist in the natural world? The 50 people who watched that night had no answers, no explanations, no theories that held water. They only had the memory, vivid, impossible, undeniable, seared into their consciousness like lightning burns into wood, a memory that would follow them forever. If this story gave you chills, if it made you question what's real and what's legend, if it made you think about the price of genius, hit that like button, subscribe to Soul Chronicles, and leave a comment telling me what you think really happened that night. Because the music never lies, even when everything else does. In the years that followed, in the slow march of time that carried everyone forward whether they wanted to go or not, a few of them tried to talk about it. Not often, not openly, not in any public way, but sometimes, in quiet moments, in private spaces. They found each other at markets where they sold what little they had grown or made, at church gatherings where they sought comfort in familiar rituals, in the fields where they worked side by side under the merciless sun, their hands moving in rhythms as old as the delta itself. They would exchange glances across crowded rooms, nod slightly with recognition that needed no words, and sometimes, in low voices when no one else was listening, when the world felt safe enough for such dangerous conversations, they would ask the question that bound them together, "You remember that night?" And the other person would nod slowly, their eyes going distant, seeing something that wasn't there anymore, seeing something that should never have been there in the first place. "I remember," but they rarely said more than that. What was there to say, beyond that simple acknowledgement? Who would believe them if they tried to explain? Who could understand unless they had been there, had seen it with their own eyes, had felt the cold that settled into that room, had watched a man age before them like time itself had gone mad and forgotten its own rules? And more than that, more than the fear of disbelief or mockery, who wanted to relive it? Who wanted to bring back the sight of a man being drained, note by note, song by song, until he was little more than a husk, a shell, an echo of what he had been? Who wanted to remember the feeling of being trapped in that moment, of being unable to leave, of having no choice but to witness something that violated every natural law they believed in, that destroyed their certainty about how the world worked? The sight of something supernatural and terrible happening right in front of them, in plain sight, and not being able to do anything but watch. Not being able to help, not being able to stop it, not being able to intervene or change anything. Just watching, always watching, forever watching in their memories, in their dreams, in their waking moments when something, a song on the radio, a guitar glimpsed through a window, the smell of a juke joint drifting on the breeze, brought it all rushing back with the force of a flood. Some people tried to explain it away in the years that followed, tried to rationalize it, tried to make it make sense in a world that should have been rational and ordered and governed by laws that didn't bend or break. We was all drunk, one man named James said years later at a family gathering, his voice uncertain, unconvincing even to himself, trying to laugh it off as nothing more than a wild night of drinking. Had to be. Ain't no other explanation. We all just had too much corn liquor and saw things that weren't there, but he didn't sound convinced as he said it. His laugh was hollow. He couldn't meet the eyes of the person he was talking to, his nephew who had asked about the scar James bore. Not a physical scar, but the kind you could see in someone's eyes if you looked close enough. Another woman named Ruth said at her daughter's wedding, when someone mentioned the old days and the music they used to hear, it was the lamplight. Must have been. Played tricks on our eyes, made us see things that weren't really there. The lamps in those old places flickered something terrible, cast shadows that moved in strange ways. But she wouldn't meet anyone's gaze when she said it. Wouldn't look directly at the other wedding guests who had been there that night. Her hands shook when she spoke about it, trembled so badly she had to put down her glass of punch. Her voice cracked and wavered. The truth was, and everyone who had been there knew it in their bones, there was no explanation that made sense. There was no rational answer that didn't require you to abandon everything you thought you knew about reality. There was only what they had seen, what they had witnessed, what they could never unsee, could never forget, could never fully reconcile with the world they thought they lived in. And what they had seen, what remained burned into their memories with perfect clarity, even as other memories faded with age, was a man who played music like it was the only thing in the world that mattered, like it was the only thing keeping him alive, like stopping would mean death or something worse than death. A man who paid for that gift with pieces of himself, with his youth, with his vitality, with years of his life measured out in songs. A man who walked into a room looking young and vibrant and full of life and possibilities, and walked out looking like death had brushed up against him, had touched him, had claimed a part of him, had taken something essential and irreplaceable. A man who somehow, impossibly defying every medical and biological principle, recovered, who looked young again days later, his youth restored by whatever dark bargain he had made, ready to do it all over again, ready to pay the price again, ready to give more of himself for just a few more hours of making music that no one else could make, music that came from somewhere beyond the natural world. Robert Johnson would die just over a year later, in August 1938, in a small room in Greenwood, Mississippi. Poisoned, they said, though the details varied wildly depending on who was telling the story. By a jealous husband who thought Robert had been making eyes at his wife, had been singing songs meant for her, had been trying to steal what wasn't his. By a rival musician who envied his impossible talent, who couldn't stand to hear him play one more time, who wanted to silence those fingers forever. By a woman scorned, by bad whiskey, by fate itself coming to collect what was owed, coming to settle the final account. The stories varied depending on who you asked, depending on when you asked them, depending on how much they knew or thought they knew or wanted to believe. He was 27 years old, so young, so impossibly young to die. But in the end, whatever force had been taking pieces of him, whatever entity had been feeding on him, whatever power had granted him his impossible talent in exchange for an impossible price, took all of him, took everything, left nothing but a body in a room and songs on recordings and a legend that would only grow with time. Or maybe he finally ran out of pieces to give, ran out of youth to borrow from the future. Maybe the debt came due one final time, and this time there was no getting it back, no recovery, no return to youth and health and vitality, just the end, just silence, just death. But before that night, before the end, before the final accounting when all debts are called in and all promises are kept, whether you want them to be or not, there was May 1937. There was a juke joint in the Mississippi Delta with lamplight that flickered and danced, with smoke that hung in the air like ghosts, with the smell of gin and sweat and desperation. There were 50 people who came for the music and stayed for something they would never understand, something that would mark them forever. There was a man with a guitar who played for 6 hours straight and aged 20 years, who gave everything he had and then somehow found more to give. And there was a question that none of them could answer, that still hangs in the air like the last note of a song, echoing through the decades, through generations, through all the years that have passed since. What kind of deal had Robert Johnson made? And was the music worth the price? Was any music worth that price? Could anything be worth giving up your youth, your health, your very years of life? Some of those 50 people lived long lives, longer than they had any right to expect, given the hardships they endured, the poverty they lived in, the violence and disease that surrounded them. They had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who never knew the Delta, who grew up in Chicago or Detroit or Los Angeles, who had lives their ancestors could barely imagine. They told the story sometimes, late at night when the mood was right and the world felt strange, and the barriers between the possible and impossible seemed thin enough to see through. And their children would listen, wide-eyed, barely breathing, holding themselves still so as not to break the spell, and ask with the innocent certainty of youth, "Did it really happen? Did you really see that? You're not making it up, are you?" And the old ones would nod slowly, their faces grave, their eyes distant, and say with absolute conviction, "It happened. As sure as I'm sitting here, as sure as the sun rises, it happened. I saw it with these eyes that have seen too much, but never anything like that." And then they would fall silent, lost in memory, transported back across decades to that night, seeing again the sight of a young man growing old before their eyes, remembering the music that seemed to come from somewhere beyond this world, remembering the cold that settled into the room despite the warm night air, remembering the feeling of being trapped in a moment that shouldn't exist, that violated everything they thought was true. Others died young, too young, their lives cut short by circumstances that seemed ordinary on the surface. Disease, accidents, violence, the grinding poverty that killed as surely as any knife or bullet. Some said it was because they had seen something they weren't meant to see, that witnessing that night had marked them somehow, had put a target on them that couldn't be removed, that whatever forces were at work had noticed them and remembered them and come for them later to tie up loose ends. Others said it was just bad luck, just the way life goes in the Delta, where death comes easy and often, where people die from tuberculosis and knife fights and simple exhaustion, from 1,000 causes that have nothing to do with magic or devils or impossible transformations witnessed in smoky rooms. But there were whispers, there were always whispers. There were always people who wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a connection, if maybe seeing that night had cost them something they didn't realize they were paying at the time. Evelyn, the woman who noticed first, who had been sitting in the front row with her glass of warm gin forgotten in her hand, lived to be 83 years old by the calendar, though some said she seemed much older, as if those years sat heavier on her than they should have. A long life by any measure, especially for a black woman born in the Delta in the early years of the century. She married a good man who treated her well, had 3 children who all survived to adulthood, a miracle in itself, worked hard her entire life, went to church every Sunday without fail, lived what anyone looking from the outside would call a normal, unremarkable life. But she never forgot that night, never stopped thinking about it, never stopped wondering what she had really seen, what it meant, what price Robert Johnson had paid, and whether it had been worth it. On her deathbed, surrounded by family who loved her and had gathered to say goodbye, who were holding her hands and singing hymns softly, she had been unconscious for hours, her breathing shallow and irregular, her time clearly coming to an end. Then suddenly, without warning, she opened her eyes wide, eyes that had been closed for hours, eyes that they thought would never open again, and said with perfect clarity, with the strongest voice she'd had in months, "He's playing again. I can hear it. Can't you hear it? Listen, just listen." Then she smiled, a strange, faraway smile that contained both fear and joy, both terror and wonder, and was gone. Her daughter Martha, who was holding her hand, who was with her at the very end, said later in a voice she could barely control that the room went cold for just a moment when her mother died, just a heartbeat. Like someone had opened a door to somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark and far away. Then it passed, and her mother was gone, and the room was warm again, and everything was normal except it would never really be normal again. But Martha never forgot that moment of cold, never stopped wondering what door had opened and where it led, and whether her mother had gone through it or just seen what was on the other side. Thomas, the field hand with the scarred knuckles who noticed early that something was wrong, stopped going to juke joints after that night, stopped listening to music altogether, wouldn't turn on the radio, wouldn't attend church when they sang, would walk out of restaurants if someone put money in a jukebox. His wife Sarah asked him why once, confused and hurt by his sudden aversion to something he had always loved, something that had been part of their courtship, part of their lives together. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes haunted by memories he couldn't share, and said simply, roughly, "I heard the price, saw it being paid. Don't want to pay it myself. Don't want to hear it no more. Don't ask me again." And she never did, though she wondered for the rest of their years together what he had seen that could make him turn away from music itself. He died in 1955, working in a cotton field under the hot Mississippi sun, his hands still scarred from that long-ago knife fight, his memories intact and vivid until the very end. He collapsed between rows of cotton, and when they found him an hour later, people said he had a peaceful expression on his face, despite the violent way he died. But his last words, spoken to no one in particular, to the air itself, to whatever god or devil might be listening, were heard by the man working the next row. Tell him it wasn't worth it. Tell him to stop. Tell him to stop playing before there's nothing left. Clara, the young woman who cried that night without knowing why, without being able to explain the tears that fell unbidden, became a teacher. She dedicated her life to educating children in the Delta, to giving them opportunities she never had, to helping them escape or transcend, or at least understand the circumstances of their birth. She never married, never had children of her own, though she had offers, though there were men who wanted her. People said she was married to her work, and maybe she was. Or maybe she was afraid of bringing children into a world where things like that night could happen. But she kept a journal, a private record of her thoughts and memories, pages and pages filled with her careful, precise handwriting. And in it, she wrote about that night. She wrote about the music, about the transformation she witnessed, about the feeling of being trapped in a moment that shouldn't exist. She wrote, "I think he knew what was happening. I think he had done it before. Many times before. I think it was the price he paid every time he played, the cost of his talent. And I think, God help me, I think he would have done it again. Would have kept doing it until there was nothing left, until the debt consumed him completely. Because the music was everything to him, more than his life, more than his soul, more than anything he could name or imagine. And maybe that's what makes someone great. The willingness to give everything for their art, to hold nothing back, to pay any price. but it's also what destroys them in the end. Her journal was found after her death in 1989, tucked away in a drawer with other personal effects, old photographs, letters tied with ribbon, a pressed flower from a funeral. Her niece Angela read it and didn't know what to make of it at first. She thought perhaps that her aunt had been writing fiction, creating stories to amuse herself or work through something. But the dates matched historical records. The details were too specific, too consistent. And the fear in those words, the awe, the sense of having witnessed something impossible, it all felt too real to be invented, too visceral, too immediate, too true. The preacher, Elijah, left the ministry 6 months after that night, walked away from the only calling he'd ever known, and no one could understand why. He moved north to Chicago, found work in a factory making parts for automobiles, lived in a series of cheap boarding houses, and tried to forget. But his wife Elizabeth told anyone who would listen, because she needed someone to understand, that he had nightmares for years, terrible nightmares. That he would wake up screaming about a man with a guitar and eyes that had seen too much, about music that came from hell itself, about being trapped in a room while the devil worked through someone's hands, about watching a soul being consumed one song at a time. He started drinking to quiet the dreams, to numb the memories, lost job after job, pushed away everyone who tried to help him, everyone who cared about him, became a shadow of the confident, faithful man he'd once been. He died in 1962, alone in a cheap boarding house on the South Side, still haunted by that single night decades before. They found him 3 days after he died, his body already beginning to decay in the summer heat. And clutched in his hand was a photograph of a crossroads, dirt roads meeting in the middle of nowhere, no identifying features, nothing to say where it was taken or when or by whom. No one knew where he got it or why he had it or what it meant to him. But he died holding it, and that had to mean something. Silas, Thomas's friend who had known Robert before that night, who had heard him play when his talent was still developing, became a musician himself after Robert died. Not a good one. He would be the first to admit it, but good enough to make a little money here and there, to play at street corners and small gatherings, and the occasional juke joint where standards weren't too high. People said his playing always sounded sad, even when he was playing something that was supposed to be happy, supposed to be uplifting, supposed to make people dance and forget their troubles. When asked why his music always carried that weight of sorrow, he would just shrug and say with a small, sad smile, "All music is sad if you listen close enough. All music costs something. You just can't always see the price being paid." He died in 1970, his guitar sitting in the corner of his room where he'd left it 5 years earlier, unplayed, untouched, gathering dust. He had stopped playing suddenly, without explanation, without warning. When his son Marcus asked him why he'd given up the thing he loved, he said with a haunted look, "I started to feel it. Started to feel something taking from me when I played. Wasn't gonna let it happen. Wasn't gonna end up like him. Wasn't gonna pay that price." The guitar was buried with him at his request, placed in his coffin. He said in his will that he didn't want anyone else playing it, didn't want it passing on whatever he thought it carried, whatever curse or bargain or debt he feared it might transmit. These were the witnesses, these were the 50, and they carried that night with them like a scar, invisible to everyone else but always there, a mark that couldn't be seen but was always felt. They didn't talk about it much, didn't seek each other out or form a group or try to make sense of it together, but they knew what they had seen. And they knew that some things in this world don't have explanations that fit into neat categories, don't follow rules that can be written down and studied. Some things just are. Some things exist beyond understanding, beyond reason, beyond the neat frameworks we try to impose on reality to make it manageable. Some things can only be witnessed, experienced, endured, and then carried forever in the deepest parts of ourselves where no one else can see. Now, decades later, nearly a century since that impossible night, the story persists, whispered in blues clubs from Memphis to Chicago to New York to London to Tokyo, debated by historians who try to separate fact from legend, truth from exaggeration, reality from myth. Dismissed by skeptics who don't believe in anything they can't measure or prove or replicate in a laboratory, who need physical evidence and peer-reviewed studies before they'll accept that something unusual happened. 50 people, they say. 50 witnesses to the impossible. But where's the proof? Where's the evidence? Where are the photographs that would document the transformation, the medical records that would explain it, the scientific studies that would make sense of it? There is none. There never was. There never will be. Just the stories, passed down through generations, worn smooth by retelling like stones in a river, polished by years until they shine, but still sharp in the important places. Still capable of cutting you if you get too close. Still true in the ways that matter, even if they can't be proven in the ways science demands. And maybe that's enough. Maybe some stories don't need proof. Maybe some stories exist in the space between fact and legend, where truth is more about what resonates in the human heart than what can be verified by outside sources, more about meaning than evidence. Maybe the story of Robert Johnson aging 20 years in one night is one of those stories. Maybe it happened exactly as described, precisely as those 50 people remembered it. Maybe it didn't happen at all, and it was mass hysteria, or tainted liquor, or exhaustion playing tricks on tired minds. Maybe it happened differently, in ways we can't know, in ways that don't quite match the story but are close enough to its essence. Maybe it doesn't matter which version is true, because the story itself carries truth in other ways, tells us something real about genius and sacrifice, and the prices we pay for transcendence. What matters is the music. What matters is the legacy that outlives the man and the mystery. What matters is that Robert Johnson played the guitar like he was possessed, like he was channeling something beyond himself, like every note cost him something precious and irreplaceable. And maybe it did. Maybe every time he played, it took some of him, some vital piece of his life, his youth, his soul, his remaining days on earth. And maybe, just maybe, it gave it back. Eventually, temporarily, until the next time, until the debt accumulated to the point where it couldn't be repaid anymore, where there was nothing left to borrow against, where the account was finally settled in full. The crossroads is real. Maybe not in the literal sense of 4 dirt roads meeting at midnight where you can summon the devil with the right words and the right sacrifice. Maybe not as a physical place you can drive to and stand in and make a bargain. But it's real in the sense that matters most, the place where choices are made. The place where you decide what you're willing to give up for what you want. The place where bargains are struck and prices are agreed upon, often without understanding what you're really agreeing to. The crossroads exists in every life, in every moment of decision, in every choice between the easy path and the hard one, between safety and greatness, between a quiet, unremarkable life and an extraordinary one that burns bright and short. Robert Johnson found his crossroads. Whether it was a literal place or a metaphorical one, whether the devil was real or symbolic, whether the bargain was explicit or implicit, none of that matters as much as the fact that he made a choice, paid a price, and created something that has outlived him by nearly a century. The price is real. Whatever form it takes, whatever shape it wears, whatever name you give it, the price is always real. Nothing comes for free. Nothing worthwhile anyway. Genius costs, talent costs, greatness costs. And sometimes the cost is more than we can imagine when we first agree to pay it. More than we'd accept if we knew up front what the total would be. Sometimes the cost is everything. Your health, your relationships, your sanity, your life itself. Robert Johnson knew that. Knew it in his bones, in his blood, in every cell of his aging body. knew it every time he picked up that guitar, knew it every time he felt the years being pulled from him like teeth being extracted. And he paid it anyway, over and over, until there was nothing left to give, until the debt consumed him completely. And the music is always real. Even when everything else fades, even when the witnesses die, and the memories blur, and the stories become legends, and the legends become myths, and the myths become footnotes in histories that most people never read, the music remains. Scratchy recordings on old vinyl that collectors treasure. Digital files passed around the internet, shared by people who never knew the Delta, never felt that heat, never understood that particular flavor of desperation and transcendence. Voices from the past calling out across decades, across generations, across the divide between the living and the dead. Robert Johnson's voice, captured forever in those brief recording sessions in San Antonio and Dallas in 1936 and 1937, singing about deals and debts and roads that lead into darkness, singing about crossroads and consequences, singing about the price he paid and whether it was worth it. And when you listen, really listen with your full attention, with your heart open, you can hear it. You can hear the cost in every note. You can hear what he gave up. You can hear the years being extracted. You can hear the soul being spent like currency. You can hear everything those 50 people saw, compressed into sound waves, preserved in grooves on wax and vinyl. Did he age 20 years in one night? 50 people said yes. 50 people saw it happen with their own eyes, watched it unfold in real time, witnessed the impossible becoming real. 50 people lived the rest of their lives knowing what they had witnessed, carrying that knowledge like a weight, like a treasure, like a curse. And now you carry it too. You've heard the story. You've walked through that night with me, step by step, hour by hour, minute by minute. You felt the cold of that room settling into your bones. You've watched the transformation unfold in your mind's eye. You've seen a young man become old before your eyes, seen the price being paid, seen the bargain being honored. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you hear Robert Johnson's music, and you should listen to it after this, you should seek it out and really hear it, you'll listen a little differently. You'll hear the cost in every note. You'll hear what he gave up to play like that. You'll hear the price being paid in real time, compressed into 3-minute recordings that somehow contain infinity. Because genius isn't free. Talent isn't free, transcendence isn't free, and sometimes the greatest gifts come with the darkest prices. Sometimes the most beautiful music is also the most painful, born from suffering and sacrifice that most of us can't imagine. Sometimes what sounds like joy is actually sorrow transformed. What sounds like celebration is actually mourning disguised. What sounds like triumph is actually loss accepted and transmuted into art. Robert Johnson knew that better than anyone. The 50 people who watched him that night knew that, and now you know it too. You carry that knowledge, that understanding, that terrible, beautiful truth about what art costs and what artists give, and why some music sounds like it came from somewhere beyond this world, because maybe it did. The music never lies, even when everything else is uncertain, even when the facts are disputed and the witnesses are gone and the truth is buried under layers of legend. The music tells the story. Listen to Crossroad Blues and hear the desperation, the bargaining, the plea. Listen to Hellhound on My Trail and hear the fear, the running, the sense of something pursuing that can never be outrun. Listen to Love in Vain and hear the sorrow that transcends the specific situation and becomes universal. The music is the evidence. The music is the proof. The music is what remains when everything else has been argued over and dismissed and forgotten. So hit that like button if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you want to listen to Robert Johnson with new ears. Subscribe to Soul Chronicles because there are more stories like this, more nights that shouldn't have happened, more witnesses who saw the impossible, more prices paid in darkness, more bargains that changed everything. And leave a comment telling me what you think. Did it really happen? Was it real or legend or something in between? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Something that violated everything you thought was true about reality? Share your story, add your voice to the conversation, because these stories matter, these witnesses matter, and the music matters most of all. Until then, remember, the crossroads is always waiting. The price is always there, written in fine print you can't read until it's too late to back out. And the music never stops playing. It echoes through time, through space, through the lives of everyone it touches. Robert Johnson's music, the music that cost him everything, the music that made him immortal. The music that still, to this day, nearly a century later, sounds like nothing else that came before or has come since. Listen to it. Really listen, and maybe you'll hear what those 50 people heard. Maybe you'll understand what they saw. Maybe you'll feel the price being paid, note by note, song by song, soul by soul.